All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Courtney Morano, and I'm the Interpretation Manager at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. But I'm also on the convening committee and board for the Association of Art Museum Interpretation, or AAMI. So thank you again for joining us. This is only our second online convening, so bear with us in case there are any little hiccups. So today's session is actually part of a three-part series that was really the brainchild of two of the wonderful staff members at Newfields, Maggie Orden and Tasha Horowitz. So we feel very lucky to have teamed up with them and be collaborating with Newfields to bring you this first in a series of three. Today's is Can Interpreters Change How Art Museums Work? But before we get started and I introduce our three speakers for today, we do want to go over a couple of just some of the ground rules. Sorry about that. Sort of participant best practices. Just a reminder to everybody to be fully present, listen deeply, and of course respond thoughtfully and respect everybody's opinion and using appropriate language. We'd love for you to turn on your video. I think we're all dying for human connection even more these days, so it'd be great if we could get to see your face. Hopefully you'll see some familiar faces and meet some new friends. Your audio should be muted as you entered, but please just unmute your audio only when you need to speak. Another reminder just to be patient with our technology in case there's any glitches. And something really helpful is if everybody could rename themselves. If you just click over your picture, click on the little three dots, rename yourself with your full name, and then your institution is also really helpful. And we will have some time at the end of the program for questions. All right. So today I have the pleasure of introducing three different speakers. Adrienne Lally Hills is the Associate Director of Studio School at Oklahoma Contemporary, and she is a Doctor of Ed student in Out of School Learning at the University of Pittsburgh. She has held leadership positions in Museum Education Roundtable, Museum Computer Network, and the Association of Art Museum Interpretation. I think she'll be first up. And then we have Tasia Johnson, who is the Manager of Interpretive Technology at the Seattle Art Museum. She graduated with a BA in Art History and Journalism from Santa Clara University, and an MA from the University of Washington in Museology, in the Museology program, and is a Getty Leadership Institute Next Generation 2018 Fellow. And then we have Tracy Truls, who is the Assistant Director of Interpretive Engagement at the Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She holds an MFA in Poetry and an MA in Art Administration from Indiana University. Previously, she was an elementary school teacher in Chicago Public Schools and has worked at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston in family programs and served as Director of Learning and Engagement at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. So please join me in welcoming our three speakers. And now I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne.
I am not able to see, oh, here it is. I am requesting a remote control.
Approved.
And commandeering your screen, thank you. So today we're going to cover a couple of things. We all love a good advanced organizer, don't we? We will have three quick presentations. We're gonna have a series of big questions that we want to pose to all the participants, which we will discuss in breakout groups led by moderators. Please note that we'll be under Chatham House rules, AKA Vegas rules. And then that will be followed by a Q&A for the panelists through the rest of the conversation. All right, so my presentation is Art Museums are late to the party, but hey, we brought a pizza. I have been doing some work as part of my doctoral program, kind of investigating the problems of practice within art museum interpretation and kind of identifying the specific problems that plague us as art museum interpreters. So we've got three key points. I'm going to provide a little bit of context for art museum interpretation. We're going to discuss the special problems of art museums and galleries and identify some ways forward. So point one, we are late to the party. I'm not going to read these point by point, but I put together a woefully incomplete history of art museum interpretation in the United States. If you have a master's in museum studies, you're going to scream at me. But it does a really good job of demonstrating how late we are in terms of formalizing as a discipline. As early as the 1950s, the National Park Service had really crystallized the fundamental principles of interpretation. And there's a lot of really wonderful work that's been done across the sector in national parks and in heritage interpretation. Let's see, next slide. So I want to illustrate kind of where we are as a nascent field based off of an example from the 2018 AAMI convening in Chicago. I had the pleasure of facilitating a game called Towards Shared Language. Just offline between y'all and me. I wanted to call it, what the hell do we call this thing? But that didn't fly. But we basically presented pictures of common interpretive materials that you find in galleries all over, paired everybody up in groups, and asked them to identify what they call different things in their spaces. Here's an example of everything everybody came up with for one simple thing that I would call a text panel. So it's clear that as a field, we have a lot of ways, or a long way to go. We also enjoyed some of the funny answers, the snarky answers that people cathartically threw into this game as well. It's a worthwhile exercise to think about the shared language that you use within your institution with your colleagues versus that broadly across the field. I will say our friends over at Smithsonian and National Park Service and in heritage interpretation have this a little bit more figured out. This is an example of a really common text used by the National Association of Interpretation folks that I was lent. Oops, I did not do that. Courtney, can you go back, please? There we go. This was a book I was lent after a year of being an art museum interpretive planner, and I remember going through it in horror as I realized that the book had been written on interpretive planning. And there was a really great wealth of studies that undergirded this discipline that we weren't paying attention to in art museum interpretation. So I did march into my boss's office and throw the book down, say there's a whole damn book already about this. Point number 2. However, in some ways, we are special snowflakes. So there are a lot of things that are generalizable that we can pull from our friends at the sector, across the sector, who have been working in interpretation a lot longer than us. But there are some things inherent to our institutions and the type of collections that we interpret that do make us a little bit different than parks, zoos, or aquaria. So for my EDD program, I have started to unpack the particular root causes of some of the problems we face. So within our institutions, we definitely are still beholden to that white cube paradigm, or maybe even that Wunderkammer, the cabinet of curiosities paradigm. We strip objects of context and present them in this kind of artificial manner, oftentimes with the attitude that if we add context or interpretive content, we're unduly influencing the affective experience of the viewer. Our exhibition topics, unlike those in science centers or natural history sites, arise from academic inquiry, not necessarily what's going on in public discourse. And linked to that, our exhibitions have historically been expressions of sole authorship. And so when you're looking at presenting something in a more constructivist model, that's kind of hard to square with somebody who's looking at this as an authorial enterprise. We also are real bad about cultural gatekeeping. So for better or for worse, we are entwined with the highest echelons of society and send a very clear message to many of our visitors that they don't belong there. The last thing is that we don't have a clear social change mandate. And I will use the American Zoological Association, or AZA, as an example. On their website, in all of their governing documents, they make it very clear that the goal of them and all of their members is to make social change, which is to have visitors to their institutions behave in a more, change their behavior to be more conservation oriented. So art museums, we don't necessarily have agreement on what total social change we're trying to affect. Appreciation of art is a pretty vague thing open to a lot of different interpretations. The art itself is also a problem. It's a really, really complex phenomenon. Our visitors more and more are having less of a background in arts education thanks to an emphasis on STEM, or heck, we're not even in school right now. People tend to view art museums as not for people like me. I encourage you to revisit the 2017 Culture Track study where they kind of go through barriers for participation for non-visitors to institutions. It's very alarming, and I bet it still tracks for today. And then we do have a lot of studies that demonstrate that people tend to like familiar figurative stuff. So if it's a cute baby otter versus an abstract expressionist painting, guess what's going to win in terms of attractiveness? And then we probably all overestimate the affective power of art. So as educators, and this might be due to our homeboy John Dewey, sometimes we forget that having an emotional personal relationship or experience with art is usually contingent upon a good degree of background knowledge and cultural capital. So what can we do to affect change in our institutions? This is a great quote from Lonnie Bunch from earlier this year in his presentation, Racism, Unrest in the Museum Sector, in which he really argues that institutions need to become more connected within and access the wealth of expertise and connection that's evident within their institutions. And kind of a subtext to that is museums do need to really honor and affirm the perspectives of front of house folks who tend to be more diverse and are the people who are working every day with our visitors. This is something that has been top of mind for art museum directors as well. There's a great 2019 study that AAMD commissioned that a lot of directors from 20 or so major art institutions are trying to realign their organizations to become more project focused, collaborative, and kind of level the power differential between curatorial and other departments so that the institution can become more audience focused. With this, you've seen an emergence of different new roles that are cross-cutting roles within institutions. And I know us as interpretive planners, we get really excited that we are one of those, but we're not the only ones. Content and digital evaluation and front of house are also amazing loci, I don't know, of points of convergence between different departments because we're all working for the visitor. And those folks can kind of cut between the silos more easily than others. But I would be remiss to not recognize that we're in the process of laying all those people off. So that's something that is important to think about whenever we're talking about the emergence of new organizational structures, that when the economic recession hits, who are the people who get to stay and who are the people sent packing? Another area for change is topic selection. I would encourage us to look more to our Science Center friends who don't necessarily immediately consult their staff scientists about what their presentation should be about. They instead go through a really rigorous process of audience evaluation to determine their programmatic and exhibition schedules. And then things that are probably above our pay grade. There should probably also be increased conversations between executive, curatorial, and the rest of the museum about these broader activities that museums engage in. Otherwise, our sphere of influence and ability to advocate for our community is pretty limited to a pretty small series of activities. But to play devil's advocate, you know, a lot of the things I've been talking about are based in incremental change. And at the same time, we're seeing huge changes within our sector and a lot of people really standing up and saying, this isn't working for us. It's not working for our museums. It's not working for our communities. So while we're articulating ways that we can affect change slowly within our institutions, I think it's important to also keep our eyes on the prize. So where's that pizza? So what do we do well? I always like to return to this graphic that Seema Rao produced, which highlights the strengths of different institutions and really kind of lays us all out together as a constellation of informal learning spaces that support community investigation and inquiry. We are really good at a lot of really good things. And although we're late to the party, I think that as we continue to experiment and study and publish those studies, we are going to be good party mates with the rest of our interpretive friends. All right, so I've got some notes for you if you want to do some further reading, and I am going to hand it over to my friend Tasia.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I was so excited when Tracy invited me to this discussion today on interpretation and relevance, because that's been top of mind for me. And so I'd really like to dive into the deeper question of who are we talking about, relevant to whom. Today, I'm not going to be speaking from an institutional perspective. I'm talking about what I see happening as a person who cares so deeply about this field. But I do work at the Seattle Art Museum, and so that is giving context to what I'm seeing and experiencing. There, I'm the manager of interpretive technology. I'm a department of one in the education and public engagement division. I'm the only position with interpretation in my title. And while I've made pathways to bridge interpretive planning processes across divisions and community advisory groups, our museum has no writ interpretive plan. But my role, particularly because it involves technology experiences, relies on working across many divisions. And so I want to share about a process that is born in tech, but I think can help museums, especially in this moment. This is Agile Scrum framework for developing software. And I think a more museum friendly or familiar version of that is the design thinking process. And both start with deep empathizing with your users and understanding stakeholders. And because they rely on cycles of iteration, they also necessitate a willingness to fail. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, because museums are generally pretty traditional. I think especially art museums, we love perfection, and so we don't like to iterate much. And then I think we're really seeing in this time, museums are averse to failing, which to me is how I can explain how many institutions, SAM included, weighed so heavily before responding to calls for Black Lives Matter earlier this summer. So when we talk about relevance and who our users and stakeholders are, I can't not think about staff. It's hard to feel that our museum work matters right now when staff morale is just so low. And I share these screenshots to show our field at large how we've been experiencing this. I think it's pretty clear that there's a rude awakening of our ability or inability to address institutional legacies of racism or colonialism. And then on top of that, like a third of us may not survive, which is very scary to think about. So even if staff morale wasn't an issue, COVID really compounds it, because now museums need to matter to dwindling audiences. Our museum's still closed, so the lost revenue from being closed causes more pressure on us to meaningfully engage people so they come back when we reopen and or support the museum. So now relevance is a matter of survival. In light of that, though, we do have a little bit of data on what our audiences want from us from the recent Culture Track findings. Audiences want to see museums actively participate in and reflect their communities. The report shows that museums aren't delivering on what audiences want, and we're effectively disappointing like 60% of our audiences. And if inclusivity and community is what our visitors want to see, the question that I think interpreters or I'm grappling with are, how do we do that with exhibition schedules that have already been established, or with more collection-based shows that are based on collections steeped in colonial collecting practices? So at my museum, I've heard a lot of colleagues complain about feeling helpless in addressing these huge systemic issues. I'm not at a director level, but I really don't think you have to be to affect change. And I think it's possible to design your own sphere of influence. So the questions on the slide are some things that I ask myself in times of feeling helpless. The answers for the top two are, for me, racial equity matters personally, professionally. I didn't grow up going to art museums because I didn't see myself there, and I want to change that for future visitors and staff. And we know that our audiences also care about racial equity. For us at SAM, there was even a fake press release that was sent out pretending to be from our institution, stating that we were closing and relinquishing all of our assets to Black community groups. And so while that's satirical, there's clearly a call for museums to change. But I wanted to share about an upcoming exhibition that's on the schedule and that we're working on. And it is an example of how I'm approaching relevance and what I can do about it with this tough exhibition. It's a collection show of one of our longtime benefactors who recently passed. She was a modern and contemporary collector, board member, docent, advocate for other collectors to SAM, and impacted many other institutions and initiatives of art in Seattle. And so, while it's great that it's really famous, wonderful paintings from mid-century America that we're really glad to have in the collection, it's still tough for me to reconcile how to work on making this exhibition of a white collector of primarily white male artists matter. So this isn't on view yet. I don't have answers. So if you have suggestions, happy to take them. And I'm not here to present final answers that I have. But I have found some agency in my work in working in technology. Technology in general brings a spirit of having so many possibilities, but I'd say that even older tech platforms like audio guides, which I think many of you all are also familiar with, that can also provide multiple perspectives. So there's opportunity in that, unlike committing to a singular institutional perspective on a wall label. Luckily at SAM, I've inherited an established practice of featuring multiple voices that are not necessarily curatorial ones. So that's luckily accepted across the museum. But I also realized in a previous difficult time that another way that I have some agency is that I have an honoraria budget. So with the budget that I still have, I have the agency to feature and pay community or BIPOC voices, and hire and pay community and BIPOC producers, not just relying on the established, I'd say lazier practice of working with white producers like a videographer that we've worked with in the past. But then I also think that even if your job isn't around developing tech projects like mine might be, I believe this is still an opportunity to lean into more cross-departmental staff teams to do the work that matters for our respective institutional survival. There's a greater demand now for digital because of COVID, and I think that opens up how we can get work done. From what I'm seeing, we have fewer staff remaining, work's getting redistributed, and remaining programs rely on smaller budgets, so we have to be creative and collaborative. And I think there's an opportunity to expand one's role beyond what it was pre-COVID to advocate for doing the work that matters, since relevance is now our survival. And so a small example of how I'm doing that with this show is that I'm training other education staff who I don't normally work with, who also care about accessibility, to help write the verbal descriptions to save on what I would normally have spent on outsourcing costs to produce them. My last question on this slide is that's about getting to know your opposite, gets at what I see as individual survival in this time. I think it's one thing to do work that you don't think that matters, but it can feel even more oppressive if you don't feel aligned or even safe with colleagues around you. And so for interpretation folks, sometimes we think that our opposite is the curator. And in this case, I am working with almost all of our curators because this collector impacted many of our collection areas. But I'm not saying that curators are inherently ideologically oppositional to us. And I'm just presenting this idea grounded in that we're all just people, and by leading with empathy, you can find common values that can move the work forward in perhaps pleasant or unexpected ways. And then I do have a caveat though. I'd say that's only if you have the emotional capacity for really leaning into getting to know your opposite. I think there's a need to remember to reduce the burden on BIPOC staff, particularly now. But I'm putting this forth because I'm leaning into this myself, because it's my own privilege as a non-Black POC in my position, and I'm the only POC manager left in my division. But in closing, and borrowing from tech again, I want to encourage us to consider how disruptive technology innovates the market. Like for me, that was back in 2007 with the first iPhone, or maybe now Amazon Prime. But how can we reframe this disruption that we're experiencing with COVID more opportunistically, being willing to try new ways of working, perhaps fail and iterate, but I think we can ultimately change the status quo of museums. Thanks, and I look forward to the breakout sessions, and I'm going to pass it over to Tracy.
Thanks, Tasia. And I'm just going to get my bearings here and click into the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to build on a lot of what Adrienne and Tasia have been saying, and heartily agree to all that. You know, this is, I'm really presenting some, I almost titled this stuff I'm doing right now, or stuff I'm trying out right now. So this is very much in sort of that like case study. This is what, this is kind of what I'm trying, and maybe there's something that would be useful for you from that. But these are more incremental type approaches to change, and they also rely on your capacity for engaging in that type of change. And, you know, just as a side note, I'm incredibly excited by so many of the initiatives that are coming from people now working outside of institutions. And I think that, I think there's essentially going to be a group of institutions that are able to pivot and be relevant, which is going to mean they're sustainable. And I think it's going to be through working with a lot of the new organizations or existing organizations in their communities, working with them. So launching into this current moment, you know, what is new right now and new to whom? You know, just recognizing that there have been many people working towards more equitable practices in our institutions, in museums for a long time. I think one thing that is different right now is that you're seeing these statements of support or solidarity from leadership, and rightfully seeing calls for action from the community, from staff. And so, you know, how can we, if you're working within an institution, how can you help make some of those verbal commitments be actual commitments through action and change? Because the one thing we know is that we're not going to get different results if we keep working in the same way. So how can we bring an interpretive lens to that work? And for this slide, I have to give a nod to Julene Chevalier, who I'm happy to see is on this session. I think like 6 months ago on Twitter, she posted a photo of a label and was like, am I the only one who does this? And I cracked up because, of course, you know, I would guess most people on this convening have a camera roll that looks something like this. And, you know, this is what we do, and it's incredibly important. You know, we love a good change out or a special exhibition. You know, that's real exciting. Those are real opportunities to do what we do best. And then I think, you know, kind of the sparkling, shining one is the reinstallation. You know, like I'm working on a reinstallation, a total reinstallation. There's been some really exciting reinstallations that have been coming out. I know Delaware, Baltimore. I've just been reading. I've been reading about, you know, just all kinds of exciting work that's happening. And it's absolutely essential in restructuring these, changing these harmful narratives that a lot of our institutions were complicit in putting out there and messaging to visitors. But then I came across this astounding, incredible article from Dr. Kelly Morgan, and I'm sure most of you have read it. If you haven't, please do. It's from the Indianapolis Recorder, and it's called "To Bear Witness: Real Talk About White Supremacy Culture in Art Museums Today." And again, I highly recommend everybody read the article if you haven't, but she says that the process of developing genuine cultures of DEI within museums cannot occur through reinterpretation alone. So thank you, Maggie. So it actually has to start with gaining a full understanding of the institution's overall interest in and capacity for building said culture. So how do we get beyond the galleries, right? And how can we as interpreters who are positioned to work across departments quite often help build that culture so that that change happens and we actually start to get something different? So one of my 4 questions is, who's on your content team? And this can actually be quite a lot of people, and especially for me. I work at Philbrook, and we have content producers all over the museum. So I'm going to use some examples just for my institution. We have content creators in the marketing division, development in 2 different departments within development, education, horticulture, and of course, curatorial. So that doesn't even get into some of the external content creators that we're working with. We're really talking about a large group of folks, right? So if we're really going to get beyond that single exhibition or project, how can we communicate? And one thing that we've been doing lately is my director started a content team meeting once a week. So it's 90 minutes a week, and we have representatives from all of those departments that I just discussed, and we talk about what are we doing right now? What could we be doing better? But I think even more interestingly, how did that exhibition really go? Or here's an article that somebody read. So creating that space for that dialogue to happen, so that everybody that's creating content on behalf of the institution is operating from the same set of principles. In some ways, it's like bringing a lot of those hallway conversations, or maybe the tail end of an exhibition team meeting conversation, into a little bit more open space to not have the pressure and time of a singular project weighing on you. So, you think about all the content folks that you have together, and maybe once you're able to get in touch with all of them, or you're building those relationships, or you have them, are all those people operating from the same set of values? And you can call them whatever you want. We all have institutional values, right? Or I think almost everybody does. And they're nice, but they're often quite vague. And how do they really apply to the content that your institution is creating? I think that it is really enticing sometimes to have a project where your personal values are really being met, and that's very fulfilling, and that's important. But if we're thinking about the institution working in a strategic way and consistently being relevant to our audiences, that those values really need to apply to all of the content that our institution is producing. So right now I'm actually playing around with writing these value statements. I have about 5, and they're each 1 sentence long, and I'm kind of shopping them around with my colleagues because so much is happening right now, and these conversations are at the forefront. And I'm throwing one out as an example. Would everyone on your content team agree that we create content with our community, not for our community? And I feel like as an interpreter, I feel like that's something that I'm like, well, of course, right? But is that something that everybody in that wider content team would immediately, A, like know what that means in practice, and B, agree with, right? So, it's a matter of the power of writing it down, right? And seeing what kind of consensus we can build, or what kind of change we can push. Maybe not everybody is on board, but putting that out there, because let's not kid ourselves. Our institutions are creating content based on values. It's just they're usually not stated, right? And where we run into problems is when someone creates a piece of content that violates somebody else's content values. So there's a piece of building the culture where you're actually getting the values down on paper as it applies to people who are producing content. Because every social media post, every text panel, every front counter conversation is, basically becomes a way of sharing interpretive content. it also gives you a way of addressing when those values are contradicted, right? So if we're all walking around with unstated values or unspoken values, then when those values are contradicted, it's even more messy to try to get to, well, what does this mean to you? And it's always good to have that conversation, but it sure would be nice, I'm thinking, and again, this is something I'm working through right now, if we had some stated values that we can at least come back to once those inevitable contradictions arise, right? You know, once that does happen, and I know many of you, I mean, we're all engaged in this, do you have a form available to you? And if so, please use it. And I know many people are really outspoken at their institutions, but some people aren't, right? And so if you don't have that forum, then see if you can create one, right? And this is where your allies come into play. And I think it's important to have them within your institution and at other institutions as well. Who's on your interpretive team? So thinking about who's creating content and then who's sharing these messages and these stories. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm a total Star Trek person. This is a crew from one of the series, and you know, they're all specialists, right? Everybody's got like a special role that they bring to the crew. And I feel like a lot of times interpreters are a specialized set of skills, you know, on an exhibition team, on a reinstallation team. But of course, the whole museum is an interpretive endeavor, right? And just like every cheesy episode of Star Trek that involves characters from all over the space station, not just the people on the crew, right? All kinds of things happen in the environment. It's important that everybody is essentially on the same team and is included. So here are some of the folks bringing some of those interpretations to our visitors. One thing that I had the privilege to be able to do last year was to bring in some very part-time gallery and garden hosts. These were floor staff who were trained, that I was able to train. So we have guest experience team here, but they don't leave from behind the counter. And we have security staff who I'm hoping to work with more. But this particular group of folks each worked 5 hours a week. And I was able to do paid training with them on interpretive strategies, of course, exhibition information, customer service, and access training and anti-bias training. And even 5 hours, having the shift be the same every week allowed a lot of them to work it into their schedules. And so I've been able to keep the same group together for quite a while. But the reports that they send at the end of each shift about here's what visitors were asking about, here's what confused visitors. I mean, six gallery hosts, 5 hours a week, that's 30 hours of floor observation time that I could never do, right? And the reports that they send in to me, I can share internally and say, hey, I'm not the one that's saying the sign is confusing, you know, even though I know it is. But here, like the gallery hosts had 5 people, they reported 5 people that were confused by this over the weekend. So can we go ahead and change that? So that is a little bit about what I've been working on. It's certainly not perfect, but I think now more than ever, it's important to just be real about here's what I'm trying, here's where I'm at. And I know I'm certainly in a learning frame of mind, and I'm trying to improve my practice and see what I can do to help museums progress, because we need it now. So I'm looking at a couple of notes here. It looks like because we have gotten into such discussion here through our presentations that we are not doing our breakout sessions. Do I have that right? And we are going to pivot to a Q&A. So I'm very sorry that we're not going to be able to do those, but all the more reason to keep attending the next AAMI sessions. I'm so excited and thankful to both AAMI and Newfields for helping create this forum for us. And I'm going to turn it over to Deb, who is going to facilitate the Q&A portion.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to, on behalf of everyone, applaud our presenters for really thought-provoking presentations. And I'm sorry we couldn't do the breakout groups, but I think everyone in here has been furiously writing notes. So you've given us a lot to think about. So in the chat, and feel free to continue adding your questions to the chat. I think our first question is about your presentation, Tracy, on working with community, and who makes that judgment when you've been that you are working with community. Is it the team or the community themselves?
I think it's an ongoing discussion amongst both. And one of the things that, I mean, as in everybody on the team being self-reflective, but pretty early on with that team meeting, we realized that it was only going to work if we had a lot of people sitting in on that team meeting with us, because Philbrook, like a lot of institutions, needs to diversify its staff. We have a majority of folks working in content production are white. And so one of the ways is thinking about who is sitting in on those content team meetings. We're also involved in sort of an audit right now that we're working with an outside partner to broker some conversations. We're also actively involved in developing a land acknowledgement. And so we have different sort of forums for communication. Some of them are just more personal conversations, and some of them, especially lately, have become more institutional, across the institution efforts to make sure that we're getting more voices in there. But it's an ongoing process that, that we're constantly trying to improve upon. And that a lot of people I know along this call, your institutions have done incredible work in this area. And so I continue to look to others for examples.
I wonder, the next question is about, can we all agree on who is community? What do we mean when we use that word? I'd love to hear from our panelists, and actually all of you, if you want to type a definition, if you have one in the chat. What do we mean when we say community?
That is
maybe
something
Adrienne, do you want to
Yeah.
take it first?
Sure. That is something that is continually litigated within our institution, and is something that we are negotiating with our communications partners, because as you guys probably have experienced, market and audience or market research has very different terminology and language that they use to describe audience segmentation than we do. So presently we're a new institution. We're the first contemporary art institution within our state here in Oklahoma City. And so we need to be very careful about being very local about how we are defining community. So it's very embedded in the unique social, geographical, and historical context of Oklahoma City. And something that we're shaping together. So in that, we've had to intentionally work with our communications colleagues and kind of learn their language so that we're able to reach shared understanding.
Tasia, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, yes, I'd love to, thank you. I'd like to challenge everybody here to consider, even though community can be very inclusive and broad, I think that it might be a useful focus for our field to think about our BIPOC communities locally. Like, I don't know what that might look like for your respective cities, but like our typical museum patrons or members who are often predominantly white, they're still going to come. But I think being more conscientious around being welcoming to people of color who aren't already coming, I think that might be something that we can focus on for defining community.
Thank you. Tracy, anything to add?
I'm just getting distracted by all the really great stuff in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know I think that it's a really great question, because it's kind of become coded language, right? That's kind of circumvents specificity and therefore accountability. So I like the idea of continually like redefining what you mean in the context when you're saying the word, to make sure you're not slipping into not talking about something difficult. I also think that you know, there's that history also of there being like community outreach, you know, that's handled through the education team, and therefore is not the responsibility of everybody on staff. And so I think also looking cross institutionally and making sure that not only do you know when you're using the word what you mean exactly, but making sure that everybody understands that they're part of that that community-centered practice is really important, because I think a lot of times there's just, I think if we can get out of our silos right now, that would be an incredible improvement. I've you know, I was a classroom teacher where I literally taught in a room by myself and felt less siloed than I have at many of my museum jobs. So that's one thing that I'm hoping right now is we can break down some of that and to define that as a staff and you know, with the people that we're serving or hope to serve.
Great answers, you, all three of you. And thank you everyone who's chiming in the chat. There's great information in here, which will be part of the archive. So we'll capture that as part of the recording. One person's asking about customer service training resources. I'm assuming you're thinking of web links, videos, or even perhaps your own PowerPoints, if you'd be willing to share them for your customer service, especially as we're thinking about being more welcoming to people who haven't been traditionally visiting us. Anyone want to take that one on?
I can share. Okay, so I don't know how people are going to feel about this, but I'm going to share it anyway. So at my last institution, I worked with an incredible person who got like a grant to go to the Disney Customer Service Institute. And she came back, and they have the 4 keys, and she adapted it for our institution and called it the 4 frames. And I gotta say, as like the director of learning engagement, I was like a little resistant. But I found it incredibly helpful, and actually even used it in education settings, because there's a hierarchy and safety is at the top. And I think it would do well for many institutions to think about that right now. But it gives your staff a rubric for making decisions to make sure that people are being respected and also being listened to, but at the same time, a value like safety is not being compromised in service to something like customer service. So that's the one frame of reference I know. It's very proprietary, so if you go Google it, you're not going to find much. But if you know anybody, or you know, there's a lot of great books too that I'm sure people could throw in the chat that have been great. And I should say that my counterpart in guest experience has just been like my best friend, especially having the gallery and garden hosts have really overlaid with her guest experience staff. And we've talked, you know, we're talking about cross training, and that's just been one of my most productive, you know, relationships outside of my department, for sure.
It's so good that you were able to build that bridge. Edward, I think, was responding to that question with this book, The Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. So that seems like a good reference. Okay, so, and then there's been a lot of comments about identifying who exhibitions are for, and then really, you know, focusing your conversations around that. Stace at Crystal Bridges, they formed an internal DEI employee resource group, and that's really great, is, you know, leveraging those resources internally that you have. And there's some really smart people working at our museums who are doing a lot of good work with diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. Let's see. Looking for another question. Is it wrong to reach beyond our local community in terms of national or international? What are people's thoughts about that in the present moment?
Right now, my institution I also specialize in digital learning, and we are pivoting to providing classes and courses and studio practice online. I have zero desire to market outside of our community, because I want this to support the eventual reopening post-COVID of our in-person programming. And that has been a little bit of a shift for my friends in communication who think, well, if we have the ability, why not? That's still proverbial butts in a seat. But we've argued for not engaging nationally. That being said, I think if your institution has a particular expertise or collection or place in the broader international discourse, absolutely not. It's not, you know, technology enables us to share broadly, and I think that it should just be done strategically in the same manner that we focus on the hyperlocal.
I'd like to throw that one to Tasia, because I know, you know, Seattle Art Museum certainly has a global audience because of the tourism traffic. How is your institution thinking about that?
I think like similarly, we're trying to survive, and we're really trying to stay closely tied to our membership base, which is still very local. And so I'd say that we are not trying to get the whole world to attend our virtual programs or offerings. But I'll say that the more relevant you can make it for your local audience, I think that resonance can be picked up by people outside of your city or location.
Yeah. Edward, thank you for your great contributions in the chat. This is an interesting question. What about communities of disaffinity? How are some of our panelists thinking about audiences that may have explicitly told you your museum is not for me?
I'm working more on the programmatic side of things, but of course, we don't have audience research to undergird it yet. But of course, contemporary art is not necessarily the most immediately connectable topic, particularly within a region that doesn't have access to contemporary art experiences, except for our friends at the Museum of Art. And so we are actually thinking more about building longitudinal partnerships and relationships with cohorts of folks who traditionally would be those disaffinity audiences through programs, not something that we're actually even thinking about compensating program participants for their time, because we get expertise and much benefit out of relationships with BIPOC community members. And Julene also mentioned, you know, whenever you are working with those groups in a more formal manner on consultation, they should be paid, as should internal staff who are being tapped to pull yeoman's duty for that really important work.
Yeah, that's been a topic, and I think we have time for one last question, but I am curious if other institutions, how you're compensating your staff. Is it through like vacation credits, or you know, how are you compensating staff for doing internal DEAI work? Crickets.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's happening at my institution. I could be wrong, but yeah.
I will say as a manager, I have a number of full-time and part-time staff. I, as a manager, try to be really aware of the people within my locus of control for whom that's put upon, and really identify to executive leadership why that's wrong. Alternatively, I have heard, and I am not an HR person, that if your job description is remarkably different than the work you're being asked to do, you can actually bill and work as a contractor. And oftentimes if people see the actual costs of what that professional work entails, they will decline and move on to somebody else. So I think it's always important to show the receipts and really put a dollar value to the person's expertise.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really, we're going to have to end it there. We're at time. I think we're having more programs. Courtney, do you want to wrap up for us? Do you have any words of what people should be looking out for?
I think Allie is going to close us out.
Allie's going to close us out.
Yeah, Allie, I can share the screen.
Thanks, Courtney.
Yeah, well, so while Courtney's pulling up our last screen of the day, just wanted to warmly thank everyone for participating. Looks like we had 57 people join us today, which is wonderful for us as we sort of venture into the online programming territory. So thank you for your active and thoughtful participation. I'm not sure everyone knows this. This was something I just learned, but you can actually save the chat if that's something you're interested. I know I have a hard time kind of following the live conversation and the chat. So there's the 3 dots in the bottom right-hand corner. If you press on that, you'll be able to save today's chat. We are recording it also, and we'll share that at a later point in time so you can go back and rewatch. I'd also like to thank our wonderful presenters today for this very stimulating, rich discussion and presentation. I know there's a lot to think about. I have to say, I think it was the first time I heard a Star Trek reference or analogy given in an AAMI presentation, so points for that. And I'd also like to thank our colleagues at Newfields again for really spearheading this series of programs. As has been alluded to, we have a couple coming up that I just want to quickly put on your radar. On Wednesday, August 19th, we have the crew from Crystal Bridges, who has organized a session titled Digital Engagement in the Age of COVID. So they're going to be highlighting a couple of the ways that they have adapted digital platforms to find new opportunities for visitors. So that will be Wednesday, August 19th. And then Thursday, September 3rd, the interpretation staff from Newfields is going to deliver a presentation which is titled Bringing People Together 6 Feet Apart. So they'll be looking specifically at how they adapted interpretive tools for their Edward Hopper exhibition. And then a big part of that session will be breakout sessions. And again, thanks for your patience and generosity today as we learn more about how to run smooth online programs and sort of are working through our timeline in real time. So hopefully we'll be able to really carve out time for those breakout sessions for that September 3rd session. If you're interested in learning more and registering for that, the link is there on the screen. We will be sending out another survey for this session. We really appreciate the feedback we received on the last one. It's really key to helping us improve the experiences that we're able to create and provide for you. And then as always, please feel free to tweet at us or to email artmuseuminterpretation@gmail.com if you have kind of broader thoughts about online programming or in-person convenings when we're able to do those again. But again, thanks everyone for joining us today. Be safe, be well, and we look forward to hearing from you.